That flight was supposed to land safely in the early morning fog of Tripoli. But just minutes later, it turned into an aviation disaster that claimed 103 lives, leaving only a 9-year-old boy alive among the wreckage. Not because of engine failure, not because the weather was too extreme, but because of deadly silence in the cockpit, miscommunications no one corrected, and the overconfidence of experienced pilots. This was not merely an accident. It was a slap in the face of modern aviation. A world where even the most advanced technology becomes useless in the hands of complacent humans who stop speaking up, stop verifying, and believe they already know. And the tragedy began. The moment the crew believed they understood each other. One decision in the fog can end over 100 lives. The A330 was approaching Tripoli in thick fog. The crew couldn't see a thing. Terrain warnings blared nonstop. In a split-second decision, they initiated a go-around. It should have been a life-saving move, but it became the start of disaster. Total darkness. No horizon. No visual cues. They lost spatial awareness in a cockpit filled with screens and alarms. The decision was right, but made under the wrong conditions, in the wrong mindset. And in aviation, being just seconds off doesn't mean a delay, it means death. This was the moment that proved one thing: even the most advanced aircraft can't save a crew that's out of sync. The technology wasn't flawed. But when pilots don't clarify intentions, don't align strategies, and don't speak with precision, systems become weapons. The aircraft started to roll, then dive. Warning screamed. Speed surged dangerously high. And not one person in that cockpit stopped to reassess or reset. When confidence overrules communication, there is no safeguard. Not even 200 tons of engineered safety. This is where the world must ask itself. Are we training pilots to fly or just to feel like they know how to? This wasn't about machinery. It was about mindset. These men didn't crash because of visibility. They crashed because they thought they were fine. Because they assumed understanding. Because they trusted themselves more than the checklist. Aviation doesn't punish ignorance, it punishes assumption. Flight 771 didn't fall from the sky. It was pulled down by silence, by certainty, and by the illusion of control. When the cockpit becomes a place where everyone's right and everyone's wrong, Flight 771 had a crew that looked perfect on paper. A veteran captain, a skilled first officer, and a relief pilot. But inside that cockpit, filled with screens and protocols, none of them agreed on a clear approach plan. They weren't incompetent, they were overconfident. They believed they understood each other without speaking. But silence in a cockpit isn't neutral, it's explosive. The danger wasn't in the system, it was in their assumptions. They assumed the other person knew what they meant. They assumed they didn't need to confirm anything. But when each pilot operates on a different logic, one in selected, one in managed, one saying nothing, even the most advanced aircraft becomes a vessel of chaos. Death didn't come from one mistake. It came from not knowing a mistake had even been made. This tragedy wasn't just a systems failure. It was a breakdown of culture. Why didn't the first officer ask again? Why didn't the captain clarify? Why did the relief pilot stay silent? Each person believed they were right, and their silence became a shared delusion. That delusion cost 3 people their lives. Fatigue won't kill you unless you're flying at 4 a.m. Aviation knows the risk. Flying between 2 and 5 a.m. is the lowest point in human performance. The circadian low reduces awareness reaction time and cognitive function. Flight 771's crew had rested for 15 hours, but that didn't erase biology. They were landing at exactly the most dangerous hour for the human brain, and no one mentioned that as a risk. No one stopped a 57-year-old captain from flying at that hour. It wasn't about age, it was about underestimating human limits. Resting doesn't mean ready. No afternoon nap can replace deep night sleep. They flew with tired minds in a dark sky under pressure to land, and no one said, "Let's slow down to stay alive." Even worse, the system knows this risk, but allows it to happen daily. Night flying isn't wrong, but night flying without biological and psychological safeguards, that's gambling with human lives. And sometimes being half a second late means there's nothing left to correct. One glance too early, and no one ever sees daylight again. The first officer saw 5.2 nm on the screen and thought it was time to descend. But that number showed distance to the runway, not to the waypoint. He began descending too early, believing he was in control. But the plane was off path, and no one else noticed. No one questioned the descent. No one verified the distance. That's what makes this terrifying, not the error, but the fact that no one knew it was an error. In aviation, you often get one chance to be right. If you act on a wrong assumption and no one stops you, gravity doesn't care about your confidence. In a field demanding absolute precision, thinking this feels about right is deadly. Yet that's exactly what happened. Because humans trust intuition. And when confidence, silence, and time pressure collide, it becomes an invisible explosive wired into the cockpit itself. A go-around can't save you if you're flying blind. At 620 feet minimum descent altitude, the runway was still invisible. The captain said, "Continue." The first officer assumed the captain saw something, so he kept descending. That was the final crack. A vague command, no confirmation, but it decided everything. Seconds later, too low terrain blared. The captain shouted, "Go around!" But it was too late. In the panic, they pulled up, increased thrust, but it wasn't a recovery. It was desperation. Their bodies were overwhelmed. Their minds weren't aligned. They launched a maneuver designed to save lives with zero clarity or vision. We must ask if go around is the last lifeline. What happens when it's triggered too late with no alignment and under cognitive distortion? It becomes a high-speed dive into disaster. Go around can't save lives if the people initiating it no longer trust their own instruments. When your brain betrays you and instinct becomes the killer, the moment go-around began, the pilot's vestibular systems malfunctioned. The surge in thrust made their brains feel like the aircraft was climbing steeply even though it wasn't. The first officer, misled by this illusion, pushed the nose down. Not to crash, but to stabilize. But the aircraft wasn't climbing. It was already diving. Worse, the captain felt the same false sensation. He also pushed the stick forward. The aircraft gained speed fast, risking flap damage. Warnings screamed, but the pilots still thought they were climbing too fast, so they kept pressing down. Every action they made deepened the dive. In aviation, feelings are fatal. But experienced pilots trust them more than rookies. That's the paradox. The more skilled you are, the more vulnerable you become to internal illusions. And that's exactly what brought down Flight 771. Sidestick priority, a safety feature turned silent killer. The first officer pulled back to recover the aircraft. Nothing happened. Why the captain had unknowingly pressed and held sidestick priority, overriding the first officer's control. It's a safety tool meant to prevent confusion. But here it neutralized the only person who was reacting correctly. No one announced anything. No one said, "I have control." The captain just pressed the button, pushed the stick, and blocked his co-pilot without realizing it. A system built to prevent conflict became a weapon of unilateral disaster. Neither man knew it was happening. Every system needs one element: communication. You can't design control authority without also designing the habit of declaring it. When a pilot overrides another in silence, even the best technology becomes a trapdoor. One child survived, and 103 silent warnings were buried. When the aircraft hit the ground at 260 knots, it shattered into hundreds of pieces across nearly a kilometer. No one should have survived. But against all odds, a 9-year-old boy was found alive near the tail section. A lone breath in a field of death. He lost his parents. His legs were crushed. He went through surgery after surgery. But he lived. And his survival forced the world to revisit this tragedy, not with statistics, but with emotion. Out of 104 people, one fragile child bore the weight of 103 souls, all because adults made the wrong decisions. Surviving isn't victory. It's a burden. It's a reminder that what went wrong wasn't technical, but human. And if we forget that, we risk making him carry the memory of mistakes that should have died with the systems that caused them. Swiss cheese model: when small holes align to tear through everything. This wasn't a case of one big mistake. It was a series of small holes perfectly aligned. The Swiss cheese model. Each layer of safety had gaps. And when the gaps lined up, disaster punched straight through. Which holes? An unclear briefing. A misunderstood command. A button press with no call-out. A misread distance. A silent moment at the worst possible time. And a biological illusion unaddressed. Each one alone survivable. Together unstoppable. Swiss cheese isn't a theory. It's a warning: the more complex your system, the more subtle your dangers. And unless we patch every hole early when they all align, it's not a coincidence. It's a catastrophe waiting for clearance. Final lesson: you don't die because you don't know, you die because you don't ask. Why didn't the first officer ask again? Why didn't the captain clarify? Why did the relief pilot stay silent? Not because they were untrained, but because fear of being wrong outweighed the fear of crashing. Aviation disasters rarely start with fire. They start with silence, with "he's the captain," with "I don't want to sound stupid." But in this field, there's no room for ego. Only life, death, and the courage to speak up. You don't have to know everything, but you have to know when to ask. Flight 771 didn't fall because of lack of data. It fell because no one said, "Wait, are we sure?" That silence still echoes through a crash site, through one child's survival, and through a system still learning to listen. No system failed. It was the people who misused the system. Flight 771 wasn't brought down by storms or malfunctions, but by deadly silences in the cockpit, where no one dared speak up, no one questioned, and no one admitted they weren't sure. One child survived. 103 others never got a second chance. And if we don't learn from that, the next disaster is just a matter of time. Technology can be upgraded, but if cockpit communication and responsibility don't change, then every safety feature is just a mask hiding the next tragedy.